Okay, calm down.
Sorry to do this to everyone. Just one more Lindsay Graham clip. I'd love for you to respond to.
What did Trump do to get the weapons flowing? He created a loan system. They're sitting on $10 to $12 trillion of critical minerals in Ukraine. They could be the richest country in all of Europe. I don't want to give that money and those assets to Putin to share with China. If we help Ukraine now, they can become the best business partner we ever dreamed of. That $10 to $12 trillion of critical mineral assets could be used by Ukraine and the West, not given to Putin and China. This is a very big deal how Ukraine ends. Let's help them win a war we can't afford to lose. Let's find a solution to this war. But they're sitting on a gold mine to give Putin $10 or $12 trillion of critical minerals that he will share with China is ridiculous.
So I thought this was all about democracy, but apparently there's quite a few other considerations, including minerals.
Yeah. But I mean, it misses the really important point here, Katie, and that is that as a result of the policy that Lindsey Graham has been pushing since well before the war started and since the war started, Ukraine is going to end up destroyed. Uh, Many hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians are going to be dead. They're going to lose a huge chunk of their territory. How much territory they lose remains to be seen. And what Ukraine is going to end up as is a dysfunctional rump state. This is a tragedy. And people like Lindsey Graham are in large part responsible for pushing this policy forward. I don't want to absolve previous administrations, going back to the George W. Bush administration. I mean, George W. Bush was in charge when this all started in April of 2008, and all his successors have contributed to this fiasco. But Biden bears principal responsibility for the present war, and he was aided and abetted in very important ways by the Lindsey Grahams. And I believe they bear responsibility for the destruction of Ukraine. It's just absolutely horrible what's happened here. And these people, of course, didn't want to settle the war when the negotiations were taking place in March and April of 2022. These are the negotiations that started right after the war began. They were perfectly happy to see us walk away, or to have Zelensky walk away from those negotiations and continue the war. And what's the end result? It's the destruction of Ukraine. If we had not pushed to bring Ukraine into NATO in April 2008 and continued to pursue that foolish policy, I believe Ukraine would be intact today. There's no reason to think that it wouldn't be. I believe Crimea would still be a part of Ukraine. It was NATO expansion that is the key element in the destruction of Ukraine. Now, of course, people in the West don't want to believe that, because that means that we bear principal responsibility for this bloodbath. My view is that we do bear responsibility, but people in the West want to blame Putin. It can't be us. It has to be Putin. We, of course, are always the good guys. The Russians are always the bad guys. So we created this story that Putin is an imperialist, that he's bent on conquering Ukraine, all of Ukraine. He's bent on making it part of Greater Russia. Then he's going to reestablish the Russian Empire. So, of course, it was good that we were expanding NATO. It's too bad we didn't expand NATO earlier, because we were dealing with this highly aggressive second coming of Adolf Hitler. That's the story that people tell. But there is, as I said before, no evidence to support this. And in fact, what was going on here is that we thought that we could shove NATO expansion down Putin's throat. Every time he protested, we doubled down. And the president who really doubled down on this was Joe Biden. If you look at the decision-making process inside the West in the run-up to the war, this is, the period November, December 2021, and January and February of 2022. You look at the decision-making process in the West, especially what the Americans were doing. It's hard to believe, but we made virtually no effort to avoid a war. was all sorts of evidence a war was going to happen. In fact, the Americans were saying a war is going to happen. The Americans were having a tough time convincing Zelensky that a war was going to happen. So it wasn't like we didn't see the war coming. And I ask you, what did we do to prevent that war? Virtually nothing. And then when the war started, as I said before, what we did was when the peace negotiations were taking place, the Israeli track and the Turkish track to settle this one, we, the Americans and the British, principally, went to great lengths to tell the Ukrainians, Zelensky in particular, to walk away from the negotiations when they looked like they were going to bear fruit.
The pictures of the Ukrainians resisting conscription are really heartbreaking. The videos of them where they're like wrestling with people trying to not serve. Just so awful.
Exactly. By the way, just talking about awful pictures, I've seen a couple pictures of Ukrainian soldiers who have been recently drafted into the army. And I would just preface what I'm going to say by noting that the average age of a Ukrainian soldier today is 43 years old. The average age is 43 years old. Combat is not for old people. Combat is for young people, especially when you're up against a juggernaut with all that firepower like the Russians. But anyway, I've seen a couple pictures of of Ukrainian soldiers who look as old as me. It's really categorically unnerving to see these people. It just shows you what terrible shape Ukraine is in. And by the way, just to switch gears slightly here, in the early stages of the war, I read a number of pieces that used this phrase to describe Ukraine. A number of people said that Ukraine is in a demographic death spiral. A demographic death spiral. This is language that was being used early in the war, maybe even before the war. I just didn't see it.
Mhm.
But for a country that's in a demographic death spiral, to continue this bloodletting makes absolutely no sense at all. I mean, the end result here is that more and more Ukrainians are going to die, number one. And number two, they're going to lose more and more territory. And you have cheerleaders like Lindsay Graham, for whom it's very easy to make the argument that we should fight to the last Ukrainian.
He
But
should go. He's in the right demographic range.
he's in the right demographic range. Yeah. We had these things called the Lincoln Brigades during the
Yeah.
Civil War. Maybe what we ought to do is create the Graham Brigade, the
Yeah.
Graham Brigades, and get Lindsey Graham and all his friends to join up and send them up to the front lines and see how they like it.
Yeah. Put their money where their mouths are.